views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect the views of BronxNet or the program underwriters.
Good evening and welcome to BronxTalk. You're going to look at me and look at the program and you can say, wait a minute, that's not where Gary normally is. And the fact is, I'm actually in Florida visiting my family. And so I'm on the road. But through the beauty of technology, we're able to do the same program that we would do if I was back home in our hometown, the BX. So I greet you this evening, frankly, with a heavy heart because you just have to look at the news and see that 8 people were killed in an Atlanta massage business. 10 people were killed in a supermarket in Boulder, Colorado. And just the other day, 4 people were shot in Orange, California. And the culprit, yes, we know people might be arrested, but the culprit is guns. Yes. And as I mentioned to our guests, a lot of times I try to go down the middle and play referee. In this case, we can't have guns in our streets anymore. And I know for me and many people in the Bronx, it's time to really get a hold of this because we can't take the sorrow and the pain, not only in the Bronx, but in New York State and throughout the United States of America. On that note, let me welcome Barry Graubart, who is the Deputy Chapter Leader for Advocacy for Moms Demand Action. And nice to have you with us, sir.
Thank you,
Mr. Graubart. And also, we're going to welcome in Eve Hendricks, who is the mother of a 17-year-old young Bronx man, Brandon Hendricks. He was a basketball star at James Monroe High School, and last June he was killed by guns. Ms. Hendricks, nice to have you with us. And right off the bat, our hearts bleed along with you. It's just completely senseless and horrible. But thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Pleasure is mine. Thank you.
I know that we have a lot to talk about. Let's start with you, Mr. Graubart. The numbers are everywhere. You just look for guns in America and things just shoot out. Ironic word to use. 393 million guns in America. That's more than the population in America. 46% of all civilian firearms in the world. In 2020, gun homicides jumped 25% from the year before, apparently fueled in part by a rise that they say in intimate partner violence. The mass shootings are just as disturbing, if not more disturbing than anything else. I don't even know where to begin, Mr. Graubart. What do we do? What's next? What is the problem and how do we address it?
Sure. Thank you, Gary. And before I jump into the specifics of the problem, I just want to say, our hearts go out to everyone who's impacted by gun violence. The tragic and senseless shootings you mentioned in Atlanta, in Boulder, in Orange, and the dozens of other shootings every single day that don't make news. And Eve, my heart goes out to you for the loss of Brandon. These shootings are just painful reminders that the problem is so severe and we shouldn't have to live with like this. We shouldn't be afraid to go to the supermarket or go to the movies or walk down the street. So we do need to bring change. You mentioned during the pandemic, I think, most forms of crime dropped during the pandemic, right? We're home all day, so burglaries were down. Stores were closed, so you didn't have petty larceny and shoplifting. But the one category of crime that went up in 2020 was gun violence. And gun violence and gun sales both skyrocketed. It was one of the deadliest year on record in 50 years for gun deaths. And we've seen just the gun sales were, through the roof. We're seeing every category of gun violence has increased, right? So it's gun violence in cities, It's gun violence, unintentional gun violence in homes. Your children are left home and, and someone has an unattended gun. Suicides have gone up. And certainly, as you mentioned, domestic violence. So, what do we need to do? First of all, we need to limit the number of guns that are available on the street. And that really comes into a couple of categories. First of all, background checks, right? We have background check laws that the lobbyists put holes in those plans when they were first passed. And those holes have gotten bigger and bigger over the years. So we've seen there are, in many states, you can buy a gun without, you can circumvent those background checks by buying a gun at a gun show. We need to close those loopholes. There are bills right now pending that our House of Representatives have passed, H.R. 8 and H.R. 1446, which close those loopholes in background checks and ensure a background check for every gun sale. We need the Senate to step up and take up those bills and vote on them when they come back.
By the way, I neglected to mention earlier, we are expecting Assemblyman Jeff Dinowitz to join us. He's the chair of the Codes Committee in the New York State Assembly. So when we talk about legislation, he'll be with us in just a moment. So we'll have him join us. Let's just talk about it, and we're going to bring in the Assemblyman for this part of the discussion. Let's just talk about the Second Amendment. And they're coming to, Donald Trump said it over and over again. They're going to take your guns away. They're going to take your guns away. They're violating the Second Amendment. Let's start there. A well-regulated militia apparently has been translated by many Americans to think that means that every American can own a gun. What's your interpretation of that? And then I know we will bring in the Assemblyman and ask him a similar kind of question.
Well, first of all, we acknowledge and respect the Second Amendment. It's been part of our country's history, and for 200 years or so, it was interpreted in a very strict sense. Not so much around the militia, but many limitations on gun ownership and responsible gun ownership. The courts changed some of the views on that, and we've seen the impact with laws allowing open carry, concealed carry, permitless carry in many states. New York, and I appreciate Assemblyman Dinowitz and his peers, because New York has some of the strongest gun laws. But what we find is that the guns are not necessarily being bought legally in New York that are being used on the streets of New York. It's gun trafficking. It's ghost guns, it's illegal guns that are coming in, and those are being used. So it's a national issue, and we need to enforce our gun laws.
One of the things that occurs to me, and maybe Mr. Graubart can weigh in, and then we'll bring in the Assemblyman as well, is that when I see a shooting in Boulder, Colorado, or I see a shooting that was really outside Atlanta, I get the sense that urban centers don't get the mass shootings that we're getting in other places, Aurora, in movie theaters. Is that a judgment that's correct, or am I just cherry picking what I want to cherry pick out of news reports?
Well, so I don't want to criticize the media as I'm speaking with the media, but
go right ahead.
But when you're looking at it, it's where does the media cover? Because I will tell you that we have seen, and if you define, as many do, a mass shooting as 4 or more people shot, we are seeing mass shootings every day in Philadelphia, in Chicago, and throughout the U.S.
Okay, so I was wrong.
Yeah, and what happens is, look, the other thing is we see it's the media gets involved. Let's face it, when there are white people shot, often when it's in an environment where people feel shooting should not occur, a supermarket, or a movie theater, but a nightclub. But I'll tell you that where shooting should not occur should be on the streets of our communities, and so we need to look at gun violence through a different lens. And the idea that, we only had mass shootings when the media shows up because it's, in a different community is just nonsense. I think we need to look at the everyday gun violence and whether it's for, a mass shooting or whether it's an individual getting shot and killed, 120 times a day, a life is taken with gun violence. Okay? And every
it's
one of those
unbelievable.
lives impacts their friends, their families, and it doesn't matter whether that happens in a suburban community or whether it's on the streets of New York.
I'm sure Ms. Hendricks has something to say about that. When a black young man who happened to have been a stellar, one of the people that the Bronx would be proud of, a basketball star who was a good student and just a great kid, when he gets shot, that's not news. But when, of course, somebody goes into a supermarket in Boulder, Colorado, that becomes national news. So we're going to let the Assemblyman wait a moment. But Ms. Hendricks, why don't you talk about that? I'm sure that that unfortunately hits home to you.
Yes, it does. It really does, because, we try not to think of black or white, rich or poor. It should not matter the race or the status of anyone. Killing is killing. It's wrong overall. It is just wrong. It should not be because he's white or he's black or he's from a rich family or a poor family. It is just killing, and it is wrong all over.
And in the case of your son, it was purely random, right?
And he was at a Sweet 16 barbecue 2 days after his 12th grade graduation and 9 days before his birthday, just minding his own business, and some monster just decided to do a terrible act.
Is it of any interest to you whether or not the gun was obtained legally? Because what I'm understanding now is many of these killings are being done by guns that are legal, that people, in fact, the gentleman who's being accused, and I hate to even call him a gentleman, the person who shot those people in Colorado apparently got a legal gun and used it. So I guess it's of no consequence to you whether it's a legal gun or not.
No, it isn't. I mean, number one, guns are not illegal here in New York State. And unless you're a police officer, someone like that person that killed my son, of course his gun is not legal. It's not.
Mm-hmm. Assemblyman, that leads us right to you. If we can, I know you are in conference in Albany at the moment, but
right.
let's just talk a little bit. You hear the question of legal or illegal. This brings in legislation. What's on tap that can help, or is New York just about as tight as it can be at this point, and there's no legislation that can assist unless we deal with how people behave?
We have been passing legislation every single year to address one issue after another relating to guns. I mean, this year there's legislation pending, and it's going to go through my committee dealing with ghost guns, for example. And we can pass all the legislation we want, and I think it helps. But I don't believe anything we do is going to be as effective as we'd like unless something is done at the national level. I mean, as you alluded to, we can have something illegal in New York, but people are getting guns from, Virginia. I think that's one of the big pipelines to New York. Guns come in from other places where they perhaps were bought legally. And unless we deal with national legislation, it's going to be really hard to change things. Nothing seems to affect the opinion of the Republicans, frankly, who consider keeping guns in people's hands more important than any other issue. It is frustrating. It's outrageous. But even beyond that, why is it that in this country we have so many more guns by far, 10 times as many, 100 times as many as any other country, but we also have more gun violence? Is it any accident that countries that don't have a lot of guns don't have gun violence?
The thing that I want to ask you to I brought it up earlier, maybe before you arrived on the program, is this whole idea of the Second Amendment. And we know that Donald Trump pushed out to people, they're going to come for your guns, they're going to take away your guns. Let's talk about the Second Amendment. Are you concerned, because you, of course, are, take the Constitution of the United States very seriously. Are you concerned that the kind of legislation that could be proposed, whether it be eliminate automatic weapons, stronger background checks, in any way, shape, or form, contradict the Second Amendment?
What I'm concerned about is that some laws that may be passed might contradict the interpretation by the Supreme Court of the Second Amendment. I mean, I could read simple English, and I don't interpret it the same way. If you read the wording of the Second Amendment, there's a comma in there that, to me, should demand a different interpretation from what the court did. But the court is the court. We can't change the membership of the court. People may retire. Over time, the composition of the court could change. But as long as there's a 6-3 very conservative majority on the court, I don't think they're going to interpret the Second Amendment any differently than was interpreted several years ago. And I think we're up against a ultra conservative court. We're up against these people in Congress on the Republican side who don't want to do anything. It's going to take a lot of work and a lot of political organizing to change all of that. And certainly the composition of the court changes very slowly. I mean, one thing Trump did with the 3 people he appointed, they were all young. They could be on the court for decades to come.
Well,
Gee,
I was hoping we were going to get a hopeful point of
No,
view, but you're being realistic. I can appreciate that.
I'm being realistic, but we got to elect people to office who are committed to dealing with this issue, and there aren't enough people in office, at least on the federal level, to do that right now.
I saw an editorial that said, Sandy Hook marked the end of the U.S. Gun control debate, because once America didn't react to 20 kids being, gunned down in school, what else would make an impression on people? So just we're going to let you go back to work, because I know you're busy. What would you like to see from Albany that could help? Is there anything that could help? Are you working on anything in that codes committee?
Well, yes. I mean, as I mentioned, we're working on ghost guns issue. We're debating the budget right now. That's why I have to get back. Money. We're also providing money to deal with gun violence. In particular, we're putting in an infusion of money that's going to be focused on those areas of New York City where there's been this massive increase in shooting. Because, as you know, shootings have more than doubled in the past year or so. Now, I personally do not attribute it to what some people say. I don't attribute it to bail reform or any of that. I believe it is 100% related to COVID and the economy that crashed and so on. But nonetheless, we have to address gun violence. If we can't get the guns out of everybody's hands, we at least got to find ways to mitigate some of it. And I mean, too many people are getting shot. Too many people are dying needlessly. And in this country, that shouldn't be happening.
Shouldn't be. Assemblyman, I know you're busy. Thank you so much for even taking a few moments to join us. I want to ask both of you, Ms. Hendricks, and also you, Mr. Graubart. Let's just talk about this question of mental illness. We hear that, well, wait a minute, mental illness is the problem. And if we put more resources to addressing those things, because the Assemblyman said, you know what? The pandemic happened. People were frustrated. People felt they needed protection. People were angry. And so, that changes their psychology. Mr. Graubart, is that something you'd like to see taken a look at to help address gun violence?
So first thing I would say is, if you have mental health issues, mental illnesses, you are much more likely to be a victim of gun violence than a perpetrator of gun violence. We can look at the numbers. People who suffer from mental health, much more likely to be victims of gun violence. The other thing is we don't have higher rates of mental illness in the United States than our peer countries in Europe or Canada or anywhere else in the world. We're not unique in having suffered from a pandemic, right? And yes, the pandemic inflamed things, because domestic violence went up. You don't have the outlets you might normally do. I'm going to go get a beer with the guys, or I'm going to go to my sisters. So the pandemic made things more difficult. But you know what happened in other countries? Yes, domestic violence went up, but they didn't have guns, so they don't have the gun deaths.
So that becomes the X factor there. The uncommon denominator, so to speak.
So I'm all in favor. I think for many reasons we should when we're providing better health coverage to our country, we should include mental health. We should include vision and dental as well. So those are all things that are helpful. But the only thing unique to America is the guns, and that's why we see our gun violence.
Ms. Hendricks, in your advocacy after the tragedy that hit your family, do you find some? I mean, we have Save Our Streets in the Bronx. We have SUV over there at the Jacoby Hospital. There are many groups and many people who agree. But do you feel that there's still kind of an undercurrent of this gangster mentality that says, well, you know what, this is how we live and we got to take care of ourselves. And so they bring out the pistol. Do you have a sense of that?
I really, really do believe that. I see that. And I personally, I don't think the pandemic has anything to do with the increase of killing. I think it's something that has always been there, but it was not as seen as it is because of, people are sheltered in, they're not going to work, people are not hanging out. So things are most noticeable. But I think he talked about the bail reform. I think if the governor enacted bail reform laws and that took away the discretion from judges to keep hardcore criminals in jail. Because of that, gun violence, it really, really went up. Shooting has increased and putting all our children at risk. I think that they need to go back and look at things that they need to be fixed, fix what they have broken.
And in
keep
a way,
criminals in jail.
Psychologically, somebody says, well, if I do this and I get caught, I'll be back on the street anyway. That's what you're alleging.
That's
here.
what I'm saying, because yes, definitely.
I want to ask you something else, and that is about video games and violence in movies or on TV. Do you have a sense, Ms. Hendricks, that this also contributes to a state of mind that says, hey, this is it's not only fun and games, we can live that out in the street.
Yes,
do you think it does?
It does. It does. It does. I mean, I have never bought my son a shooting video game. The only video game my son played was basketball video game.
I was going to say, you put a basketball in his hands. That was probably the best thing you could do.
Yes, but all these video games about shooting and the movies, they have a lot to do with how most of these kids look at things. And the bottom line is they think that, especially if they are underage, they commit a crime, they will be right back on the streets. Mm-hmm. Can't have that.
Mr. Graubart, I'd like to just address that. I mean, I understood what you said a moment ago about, you say, well, wait a minute, other countries have the video games and all these other things, but they don't have the guns. Do you think there is this kind of psychological component in it that it increases it? I mean, we talk about white supremacy. There are other things that are coming into play that are kind of keeping the ball rolling when it comes to gun violence.
Again, we go back to the data, and the data says that we're not so different than any other country in terms of look at the top movies that we're watching in other countries. Look at the video games. So, look, there are, at any given moment, could there be any, are there things that impact the culture that do things? I do. One of the things we've seen this year, again, combination of the pandemic and some of the white supremacist groups driving around communities made many people become first-time gun buyers who might never have bought a gun. The numbers do show that not only did gun sales go up this year, but a lot of people who'd never owned a gun. And you can see it in communities that are under attack where they feel this is, whether it's Black and brown communities or now the Asian community saying, if we're going to be victim, what do we do? And, what we know is that a gun in the house makes you much more likely to die by gun violence. So it's not a rational, good decision. But we do see that's driving gun purchases.
Yeah, I want to address that. Many people who say, well, wait a minute, you know what? I'm going to take care of myself and I'm going to take care of my family. And they perceive that the way to do that is to have the weapon available. And I mean, there are many people in the Bronx, I know who they are, who say, you know what? I'm going to do it legally. I'm allowed to have it. I'm going to have it. I mean, do you say, hey, no, you can't have it? Or do you say there's a way that you can own the gun, even though you don't recommend it, but that it we can't take it away from you. Let's just crack down on how it's used.
Sure. And no, I'm not going to tell someone you can't, if you're legally entitled or allowed to buy a gun, I'm not going to tell you can't do that, right? The laws are there to allow that. But what we do know, again, we do see the data and we do see the numbers, which says, a woman is 5 times more likely to be killed in a domestic violence incident if there's a gun in the house. We see over and over the numbers show that having a gun, when you look at all the kids who normally would be in schools all this past year and who were at home via Zoom, and sometimes mom or dad can't be in 3 rooms at one time watching everything.
But you see, I want to just interrupt before we run out of time. But that's where legislation for gun locks and other things can really help. And somebody who says, I'm law abiding, but I'd like to make sure that I have a gun available, then let's make sure that you really do keep it safe. It's not foolproof. But right, I mean, and
we do that in New York. In New York State, we pass safe storage, and we have a program called Be Smart, where we teach people not only to make sure their guns are secured, but when their kids go on a play date to another kid's house, find out if there is a gun and if it's unsecured.
Ms. Hendricks, a final word from you. You want to talk to other moms about what they should think about when it comes to their children? What really is your final message for us this evening?
I never want to see another mother suffer the pain that I suffer each day. You need to find out who your kids hang out with, where they are going, go to their schools, speak with their teachers, spend time with your kids, get them involved in activities, go out in your community and see what's going on in your communities. And just be mindful that no one is perfect, but we have to respect each other, work with the community, and most of all, we have to get the cops involved. We need the cops in our communities. We need them to police our communities, to keep our kids safe. And we need our kids not to be afraid of the officers in our community.
Well, you have now laid the groundwork for part 2 of this dialogue, because we do need to talk about policing and make sure it's done appropriately, and certainly in many of our communities. Eve Hendricks, as I mentioned at the top of the show, we're all with you. We all sympathize and our hearts bleed with you for the memory of your wonderful son. And hopefully it'll never happen to anybody else again. Barry Graubart, thank you so much for joining us. He's the Deputy Chapter Leader for Advocacy for the New York chapter of Moms Demand Action. Barry, thank you so much for joining us. And let's keep the dialogue going. I think we have a chance if we keep talking about it in this way. So we thank you for joining us as well.
Thank you, Gary.
Thank you.
Folks, next week we will have a program about housing, and we'll get into all discrimination and evictions and all the other important issues regarding Bronx housing. Thanks to our great producers, Stephen Powell and Rebecca Hemick, and we'll see you then. Good night.